Grant Whitmore, the name that echoed through Wall Street like gospel, was the kind of man who'd built empires by crushing others beneath his designer shoes. A self-made tech billionaire with a jawline chiseled by genetics and a heart calcified by decades of greed, arrogance, and untouchable success. That morning, as the sun rose over Manhattan and the world buzzed about the spectacle unfolding in federal court, Grant wasn't nervous, wasn't fearful, wasn't even mildly inconvenienced. He was annoyed. Annoyed that he had to wake up early. Annoyed that reporters had the audacity to surround his private car. Annoyed that the court had the nerve to bring charges against him, and more than anything, annoyed that he would be forced to sit in a room full of what he considered intellectual and financial peasants while his life was put under a microscope. He didn't believe in the justice system because in his world, justice was just another word for negotiation, and he never negotiated unless he was the one dictating the terms. As his security team opened the door to his sleek black Rolls-Royce, Grant adjusted his designer cufflinks, smoothed his Italian cashmere overcoat, and slid his gold aviator sunglasses over his eyes like a king entering a land of lesser beings. The media frenzy outside the courthouse gates was near. Riotous reporters screamed his name. Cameras flashed like lightning, and protesters held signs that read, "Lock him up. Corruption has a face, and justice for the victims." Grant smirked. Victims, as if buying politicians, manipulating stock prices, and rewriting regulations to benefit his empire at the expense of the middle class was somehow criminal. "They're just jealous," he whispered to his lead attorney, Evan Grayson, a man as expensive and ruthless as Grant himself. They walked up the marble steps together, flanked by 3 other attorneys who had successfully helped oligarchs escape justice on more than one occasion. The courtroom itself was grand, a relic of America's historic obsession with justice and theater-arched ceilings, wooden pews, brass fixtures, and towering windows that let the morning light spill across the floor like divine judgment. Grant entered like he owned the place, like it was his boardroom, his game. His every step echoed confidence, entitlement, and disdain. As he approached the defendant's table, he didn't so much as glance at the press box, the jury seats, or the public benches. His gaze was forward, like a man walking a red carpet, not into a trial that could imprison him for the rest of his life. People watched him as if he was some ancient deity walking among mortals, awestruck, enraged, fearful, or disgusted. None of it touched him. He sat, adjusted his Rolex, crossed his legs, and leaned back, already bored. The courtroom slowly filled reporters, observers, legal staff, and members of the community who had waited overnight for a seat. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff entered, his voice booming, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Amara Griffin." The room stood as one, a wave of collective respect, except for one man, Grant Whitmore, who remained seated, arms folded, a smug grin curling on his lips like a silent challenge. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like tremors before an earthquake. Some thought he hadn't heard. Others who knew his reputation understood it for what it was, intentional. Judge Griffin entered with grace and power, a black woman in her early 50s, wearing her judicial robes like armor, her gaze sharp, steady, and commanding. Her reputation preceded her Harvard law, a history of unshakable ethics, and a nonsense approach to power, corruption, and the abuse of law. She had sentenced crime lords and CEOs alike, and her court was a place where truth found its voice, no matter how rich or powerful the accused. As she approached the bench, her eyes locked briefly with Grant's. She noticed, of course, that he hadn't stood. She noticed the way his gaze flicked to her robes, her skin, her gender, and then, away as if she were beneath him. She noticed, but she said nothing, not yet. She sat slowly, deliberately, allowing the silence to fill the room like a rising tide. The bailiff announced the charges: securities fraud, insider trading, international bribery, obstruction of justice, one carrying decades of prison time. Grant barely blinked. His attorney entered a plea of not guilty, and the trial formally began, but the air hadn't cleared. It still buzzed with the electric residue of his disrespect. People whispered in corners of the room, glancing at the judge for a reaction that never came. That first morning, Grant acted like he was the judge. He whispered to his lawyers during opening statements, rolled his eyes when Griffin ruled against his objections, and chuckled when witnesses spoke of the companies he had bankrupted. He didn't care. He thought the game was rigged in his favor, as it always had been. After all, he had dined with senators, vacationed with ambassadors, donated millions to political campaigns. To him, Judge Griffin was just a hurdler, symbolic figure who'd play her role and then retire into the shadows of history while he went back to his penthouse and watched his stock rebound. But what he couldn't understand was that Judge Griffin had been underestimated her entire life. The granddaughter of sharecroppers from Georgia, the daughter of a civil rights attorney and a public school teacher, she had earned every ounce of her success with grit, brilliance, and relentless integrity. She had faced men like Grant before, who called her girl, men who smirked as they spoke over her, men who thought her robe was just a costume and her gavel a toy. And every time she had dismantled them, not with anger, not with rage, but with cold, unshakable truth and precision. That first day, she made no mention of his refusal to stand. She didn't scold him, didn't assert her authority with words. She let the silence do the talking. She let him show the world who he was. But behind her eyes, behind the calm exterior, she was writing a different kind of judgment, a judgment that would ripple through history like a dropped stone in still water. After court recessed, the story exploded online. Billionaire refuses to stand for Black Judge blared headlines. Talk shows, podcasts, and news stations replayed the moment on loop. Some claimed he was protesting the trial itself. Others called it open racism. Grant didn't care. He wanted the attention. "Let them talk," he said to his PR manager, sipping champagne in his penthouse that night. "I owned the narrative." But he didn't know that the very woman he'd disrespected had already begun dismantling his defense piece by piece. In chambers, Judge Griffin pulled court clerks to review sealed files, subpoena records that had been buried in red tape, and revisit evidence others deemed irrelevant. She was methodical, strategic. She knew his type, knew how they buried truth, beneath money, power, and complexity. But the law was her domain, and arrogance would be his downfall, because when justice takes her time, she does not forget who refused to rise when she entered the room. As the days passed, the courtroom became a battleground not just for justice but for dignity, power, and the unseen war waged in silence between Grant Whitmore and Judge Amara Griffin. Each morning, the billionaire entered with the same arrogant swagger, wearing a mask of contempt that barely concealed the growing unease beneath, while Judge Griffin maintained a serene composure that unsettled even the most seasoned legal veterans, for her eyes bore into him with a quiet fire that promised consequences far beyond mere legal verdicts. She was not just a judge enforcing law, but a guardian of principle, a sentinel who understood that the courtroom was a theater for truth, and no amount of wealth or privilege could rewrite its script. Whitmore's legal team tried every trick in their playbook: motions to dismiss evidence, challenges to witness credibility, delaying tactics, and attempts to intimidate prosecution witnesses, but Griffin's rulings were precise and unyielding, rejecting baseless claims with a calm decisiveness that left the defense scrambling to adapt. And as witnesses took the stand, from whistleblowers within Whitmore's empire to former employees who risked everything to expose his ruthless tactics, the mosaic of his true character was laid bare: a man who manipulated markets, coerced rivals, and wielded his fortune as a weapon to silence dissent. More than once, Whitmore whispered insults to his lawyers, his fingers tapping impatiently on the polished wood of the defendant's table, his eyes rolling with disdain whenever Griffin reminded him of courtroom decorum or ruled against his objections. And during one particularly heated exchange, when the judge denied a motion to exclude a damaging email, Whitmore muttered under his breath, "This is nothing but affirmative action nonsense," a comment that sent a shockwave of gasps and murmurs through the courtroom. But Judge Griffin did not rise to the bait. Instead, she paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air like a challenge to the very essence of justice and equality she embodied, her silence more powerful than any rebuttal, signaling to everyone present that his contempt was noted and recorded, becoming part of the trial's fabric. Behind her composed exterior, Griffin was meticulously constructing a case that was as psychological as it was legal, understanding that Whitmore's arrogance was both his armor and his vulnerability, and by allowing his disrespect to surface openly, she exposed cracks in his facade that no amount of money could mend. The media caught every moment, amplifying the story of the defiant billionaire and the unshakable black judge, transforming the trial into a national conversation about race, power, and accountability in America's highest circles. Meanwhile, in private chambers, Griffin delved deeper into the labyrinth of Whitmore's dealings, uncovering layers of corruption tied to offshore accounts, backdoor deals, and a network of influence that stretched across continents. And as the prosecution gathered irrefutable evidence, the walls began closing in on the once untouchable titan. Whitmore's arrogance gave way to frustration. During breaks, he snapped at his attorneys, his once confident demeanor replaced by commands and visible anxiety. He attempted to call high-profile contacts to sway the process, but Griffin's pretrial motions had already limited outside interference, and the judge's reputation for impartiality ensured her courtroom was a fortress against corruption. As witness after witness recounted stories of manipulation, exploitation, and deceit, the jury's expression shifted from skeptical to solemn, and the public support for the judge surged. Community leaders, activists, and legal scholars praised Griffin's steadfastness, seeing in her an embodiment of justice that transcended the black robes she wore. All the while, Whitmore was forced to confront a truth that no amount of money could mask. His power was not absolute, and this judge was a force he had gravely underestimated. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric, charged with a palpable tension that seemed to draw everyone's focus to the silent war between two wills: the billionaire's desperate fight to maintain control and the judge's unwavering resolve to see justice served. Even minor procedural rulings by Griffin felt like strategic moves in a chess game, each decision stripping away a layer of Whitmore's defenses and inching the trial closer to a verdict that would shake the foundations of his empire. On the sixth day of testimony, the prosecution presented a pivotal witness, a former personal assistant who had worked closely with Whitmore and had remained silent out of fear for years, her voice steady yet emotional as she detailed threats and coercion behind closed doors, revealing the brutal underbelly of Whitmore's empire. The courtroom hung on every word, the gravity of her testimony rippling through the air like thunder. Whitmore sat frozen, the arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a pale mask of shock and fury, while Judge Griffin allowed the testimony to unfold without interruption, her expression unreadable but her resolve crystallizing. It was clear that the tide was turning, and the man who once ruled markets and manipulated governments now stood exposed in the glare of unassailable truth. Throughout the week, the social media storm around the trial intensified, with clips of Whitmore's refusal to stand replayed millions of times, debates raging over race, privilege, and respect for the law. Opinion pieces hailed Judge Griffin as a hero of integrity and justice, while critics tried to undermine her authority, but none could deny the seismic shift the trial represented in the American consciousness. And in the quiet moments away from the public eye, Judge Griffin prepared for the battles ahead, knowing that this case was more than a trial. It was a reckoning, not just for Grant Whitmore, but for a system long marred by inequality and corruption. As the final testimonies concluded and closing arguments approached, the billionaire's arrogance was replaced by desperation, his every move calculated. But the damage was done, and the judge who had once simply taken her seat without confrontation was now the architect of a verdict that promised to echo far beyond the walls of that grand Manhattan courtroom. The trial, which had already captivated the nation, reached a turning point the moment Judge Amara Griffin uncovered a piece of evidence so explosive that it threatened to shatter the fragile veneer of Grant Whitmore's carefully constructed empire. It was late one evening in chambers when Griffin, reviewing stacks of digital files and overlooked documents, stumbled upon a sealed affidavit that had been submitted by a former assistant months earlier but had been misfiled and forgotten. In the chaos of the sprawling case, a revelation that sparked a surge of anticipation in her mind as she recognized that this affidavit detailed threats, manipulation, and cover-ups far more sinister than anything publicly known. And when she summoned the assistant to testify, the courtroom held its collective breath. The witness, a woman whose voice trembled but whose courage burned bright, recounted stories of Whitmore's ruthless tactics behind closed doors, intimidating employees who dared question his orders, bribing officials to bury investigations, and most damningly joking callously about buying judges like stocks, a phrase that hung in the air like a curse and sent ripples of shock and outrage through the courtroom. Throughout the testimony, Grant's composure cracked, his confident smirk faded, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands clenched tightly as if trying to hold on to control that was slipping through his fingers. Judge Griffin, however, maintained a calm and dignified presence, allowing the witness to speak fully and pausing the proceedings when the emotional weight of the revelations threatened to overwhelm her. Showing empathy that contrasted starkly with the defendant's arrogance, the media captured every moment, broadcasting the assistant's testimony live, turning the courtroom drama into a national event watched by millions, many of whom saw in Judge Griffin's steadfast handling of the case a symbol of justice finally piercing through the layers of privilege and corruption. The assistant's words exposed not only Whitmore's crimes but also the depth of his moral bankruptcy, and when she detailed how he had once joked about manipulating the judiciary itself, the room gasped in unison, some in disbelief, others in vindication of the long-suspected truth. This moment marked the unraveling of Grant Whitmore's facade, and as the trial progressed, witnesses previously intimidated by his power stepped forward, emboldened by Griffin's unyielding pursuit of truth, each testimony weaving together a tapestry of deception, greed, and callous disregard for the law and the people affected by his actions. Grant's defense team faltered, their objections overruled repeatedly as the judge methodically dismantled their attempts to discredit witnesses or bury evidence, revealing her mastery not only of the law but of courtroom strategy and human psychology. Behind the scenes, Griffin worked tirelessly, coordinating with prosecutors to unearth more documents, tracking financial transactions, and subpoenaing records that unveiled offshore accounts, bribes, and illicit schemes that painted a picture of systematic corruption. The courtroom itself became a stage where the mighty titan who once thought himself invincible was steadily reduced to a man on the edge, his arrogance replaced by desperation, and his defiance gradually muted by the weight of undeniable proof. At one point, when a particularly damaging email was read aloud, a message from Whitmore ordering a subordinate to silence the dissenters by any means necessary, even the jury leaned forward, faces grim, realizing the gravity of his actions. The tension between Whitmore and Griffin grew palpable, a silent war of wills that transcended the spoken word. She was a mountain of integrity, immovable and towering, while he was a storm of fury and frustration, lashing out but unable to break through. During recesses, he tried to rally his attorneys and call in favors, but the judge's strict limitations on outside influence had neutralized many of his usual power plays. His refusal to stand at the trial's start, once seen as a mere act, of contempt, now took on deeper meaning, a symbol of his resistance to a system that was finally holding him accountable. And as public opinion swung decisively in favor of justice, with protests outside the courthouse cheering Judge Griffin, Grant found himself isolated, cornered by a system he had long believed was pliable. The climax of the chapter came with the assistant's testimony, a turning point that marked not just a legal victory for the prosecution, but a moral one for the judge who refused to be intimidated or undermined. When she ended her testimony, the courtroom erupted in quiet reverence, the weight of truth settling heavily on every heart present. Judge Griffin's final words to Grant in that session, quiet, powerful and filled with unspoken warning, resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. "You underestimated the law, and you underestimated me. Neither will show mercy." This moment set the stage for the impending verdict, one that promised to redefine justice and hold a once untouchable man accountable in ways no one could have imagined. The final day of the trial arrived with a heavy air of anticipation and solemnity that rippled far beyond the walls of the Manhattan courthouse. As crowds gathered outside in the early morning mist, journalists prepared their cameras, and the public awaited a verdict that had become emblematic of a broader struggle for justice and equality in America. Grant Whitmore entered the courtroom noticeably diminished, his once confident stride slowed, his tailored suit slightly rumpled, and the usual arrogant gleam in his eyes replaced by a shadow of uncertainty and apprehension that did not go unnoticed by anyone present, including the jury whose members had witnessed every moment of his unraveling over the course of the weeks-long trial. As Judge Amara Griffin took her seat at the bench, the courtroom fell into an expectant hush, a collective breath held in the stillness as she prepared to deliver what would be a historic ruling. The tension was palpable as the bailiff called the courtroom to order, and before the proceedings began, Grant, now stripped of his earlier defiance, stood slowly and deliberately as Judge Griffin entered, the gesture resonating as a reluctant yet profound acknowledgement of the authority and dignity she embodied. A moment captured by the dozens of cameras that had broadcast his earlier disrespect around the world, transforming it into a powerful symbol of accountability. Throughout the day, the atmosphere was electric, with every word uttered by Griffin weighing heavily in the balance of justice. And when the jury returned with their verdict, the silence was broken by a unanimous declaration of guilt on all major charges, including securities fraud, insider trading, bribery, and obstruction of justice, a verdict that sent shockwaves through financial markets and political circles alike. However, the most unforgettable moment came not from the verdict itself but from Judge Griffin's sentencing, a measured and profound address that transcended the typical courtroom rhetoric, as she condemned Whitmore's abuse of power and greed, before ordering a 25-year prison sentence, coupled with the unprecedented liquidation of significant portions of his vast assets, to establish a national scholarship fund dedicated to underprivileged black students pursuing careers in law, a direct rebuke to the very culture of privilege and exclusion Whitmore had personified. Her words resonated deeply as she stared directly into the eyes of the man who once sneered at her courtroom, stating, "You mocked the law, demeaned this court, and disrespected the dignity of every person it protects. Your punishment is not only to serve time but to invest in a future your actions sought to suppress." The crowd outside erupted in applause and tears, many seeing in Judge Griffin's decision a beacon of hope and a call for systemic change. Social media exploded, making Griffin a viral sensation and an icon of justice, who had not only upheld the law but transformed it into an instrument of empowerment and restoration. Whitmore was escorted away in handcuffs, his empire in ruins, his legacy forever tarnished by the trial that began with his arrogant refusal to stand and ended with his total defeat before the unwavering strength of a judge who refused to be intimidated or undermined. In the weeks and months that followed, Griffin's ruling inspired legislative reforms and renewed discussions on racial and economic justice, while Grant's downfall served as a stark reminder that no one, regardless of wealth or status, stands above the law. And as she walked out of the courthouse that day, her head held high, Judge Amara Griffin knew she had done more than just deliver a verdict. She had reshaped the course of justice itself, proving that true power lies not in money or influence, but in integrity, courage, and the unwavering pursuit of truth.